Power does not announce itself. It sits quietly in 12C recording everything. The words hung in the air of courtroom 7B as Devon Rhodes leaned forward in the witness stand, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. The attorney nodded, inviting him to continue his testimony about what happened on Atlantic Airlines Flight 653. The crowded courtroom fell silent, captivated by the calm intensity of the man before them. Devon was not just any passenger. He was a man who understood that in a world that often denied his dignity, documentation was his most powerful ally. He was a man who knew that sometimes justice needed more than memory. It needed evidence. 3 months earlier, what began as a routine flight from Boston to San Francisco had transformed into a battlefield of bias, an arena where casual discrimination met unwavering resilience. What flight attendant Miranda Parker and passenger Judith Ellison never realized was that every dismissive glance, every biased word, every subtle act of discrimination was being methodically recorded. The tape did not lie, and it was about to change everything. Devon Rhodes moved through Logan International Airport with practiced efficiency, his carry-on rolling silently behind him. At 40, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had navigated both boardrooms and biases with equal skill. As one of the few black venture capitalists in the tech industry, he had learned that preparation was not just professional, it was personal protection. His charcoal Brioni suit was impeccably tailored offset by a simple black merino t-shirt beneath, practical yet refined for the long flight ahead. On his left wrist, a vintage Rolex Submariner, his father's given to him upon making partner at his first investment firm, served as both timepiece and subtle reminder of legacy. Around his neck hung what appeared to be standard noise-canceling headphones, but closer inspection would reveal a subtle modification, a high-quality lapel microphone clipped discreetly to the cable. It was a tool of his trade, initially adopted for recording investment pitches and business insights during his frequent travels. The way Devon organized his belongings revealed his methodical nature. His bag was packed with military precision, electronics in designated pockets, documents in clear folios arranged by priority essentials, always within easy reach. Nothing left to chance, nothing out of place. This was not mere fastidiousness. It was a personal system born of necessity. Experience had taught Devon that this small recording device served a dual purpose. After a particularly humiliating incident 3 years earlier, when a hotel staff member had accused him of trespassing in the executive lounge, despite his platinum membership, insisting with increasing hostility that people like him must be in the wrong place until a white colleague vouched for him, Devon had made documentation a habit. The microphone connected to his phone recording continuously during public interactions. Not out of paranoia, but pragmatism. Insurance policy, he often thought to himself. Because memory can be disputed, evidence cannot. Miranda Parker stood at the boarding gate greeting passengers with a professional smile that came from 23 years of flight service. At 45, her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect French twist, her Atlantic Airlines uniform pressed and pristine. She took pride in her appearance, in her authority, in her ability to read passengers, a skill she considered essential to maintaining order in the cabin. She believed herself fair, efficient, and thoroughly unbiased. She had attended every required diversity training session. She had the certificates. What Miranda did not recognize was how her warmth shifted subtly depending on who stood before her, how her assessment of problem passengers often correlated with factors beyond behavior. Her tight smile and quick assessing glances at certain travelers betrayed unconscious categorizations she would vehemently deny making. Several rows away, Judith Ellison waited impatiently to board her designer handbag, clutched close, her posture radiating entitlement. At 60, she was accustomed to deference, to having her needs addressed immediately. Her meticulously maintained appearance, from her salon-highlighted hair to her expensive, yet understated jewelry, was armor of status. She considered herself simply traditional, someone who appreciated the way things used to be. Her habit of tapping her manicured nails against her boarding pass when impatient signaled a woman accustomed to controlling her environment. Other passengers milled about the gate area. Tyler Ramirez, 28, fidgeted nervously with his boarding pass, repeatedly adjusting his glasses and checking the time on his phone. Fresh out of his MBA program and heading to his first major tech interview in San Francisco, he was lost in thoughts of algorithms and equity valuations. His habit of muttering financial equations under his breath when anxious had earned him curious glances from nearby passengers. Behind him stood Captain James Wilson, 55, a veteran pilot with a military background and a reputation for running a tight ship. The captain's posture, straight-backed shoulders square, and his habit of scanning the gate area with practiced thoroughness revealed his 20 years of military service before joining commercial aviation. None of them knew how their lives would intertwine in the confined space of Flight 653, how the next 6 hours would lead to consequences that would extend far beyond their destination. Zone 2 now boarding through Gate 17B. Devon moved forward with the line boarding pass and ID ready. As he scanned his documents and entered the jet bridge, he mentally prepared for the flight ahead. 6 hours to San Francisco, hopefully productive hours, reviewing investment portfolios, and preparing for his meetings with promising AI startups. Flight 653 was a Boeing 787, configured with first-class premium economy and main cabin. Devon's seat, 12C, was an aisle seat in premium economy, worth the extra cost for the legroom, particularly given his recent knee injury from a charity basketball game. The cabin was filling steadily as he approached his row. He stowed his carry-on efficiently, then settled into his seat. The premium economy section was arranged in a 2-3-2 configuration, placing him on the aisle of the middle section. In 12B, the middle seat, Judith Ellison was already settled, her belongings meticulously arranged. She glanced up as Devon sat, her eyes flicking over him in quick assessment. Her hand moved almost imperceptibly toward her purse, pulling it closer. Devon noticed. He always noticed. These small gestures had become familiar punctuation marks in the narrative of his daily life, so common they barely registered as anything but background noise. He nodded politely to her, then focused on getting settled. "Excuse me," Judith said, her voice carrying a note of preemptive complaint. "I hope you are not going to use both armrests." "Just the right one," Devon replied evenly, his tone professional, pleasant. "The middle seat gets both sides." This seemed to surprise her. Perhaps his knowledge of unwritten airplane etiquette, perhaps his composed response. She blinked, then returned to her magazine without acknowledgement. In seat 12D across the aisle, Tyler Ramirez glanced over nervously. He had witnessed the exchange, brief as it was, and something in it made him uncomfortable, though he could not quite articulate why. He offered a small smile of solidarity to Devon, then returned to his review materials, his foot tapping an anxious rhythm against the carpet. Devon inserted his earbuds and pressed the familiar sequence on his phone that activated his recording app. He did this automatically now, a habit formed from experience. Innocuous interactions could shift without warning, and having a record had saved him from becoming a disputed narrative more than once. The app was set to conserve battery by recording audio only, storing it in encrypted form that uploaded to his secure cloud as soon as connectivity was available. The safety demonstration began. 3 flight attendants moved through their choreographed motions while the video played. Miranda Parker stood at the front of the premium economy section, demonstrating the oxygen mask procedure with practiced precision. Her gaze swept over the passengers, assessing, categorizing. Cabin crew armed doors, and cross-check came the announcement from the flight deck. Captain Wilson's voice was steady, authoritative. "Flight attendants prepare for departure." The plane backed away from the gate engines, humming to life. Devon felt the familiar weight of acceleration as they taxied, then the surge of power as they began their ascent. Boston fell away beneath them, the Atlantic coastline giving way to clouds. He had no way of knowing that this routine beginning would lead to one of the most significant confrontations of his professional life. The seatbelt sign had been off for 20 minutes when Devon felt the familiar ache in his left knee. The injury from the charity basketball game 2 weeks earlier was healing, but long periods of immobility still triggered discomfort. He shifted slightly, extending his left leg a few inches into the aisle to relieve the pressure, careful to keep the movement minimal to avoid disturbing others. The stretch provided immediate relief. He returned to reviewing the pitch deck from a promising robotics startup, making notes on his tablet. The cabin had settled into the quiet hum of a long flight. The white noise of air circulation, occasional movements, subdued conversations. "Excuse me." Judith's voice cut through his concentration, sharp and loud enough to draw glances from nearby passengers. "Your leg is in my space." Devon looked down, puzzled. His foot was clearly in the aisle, not encroaching on her area at all. "I am sorry, but my foot is in the aisle, not in your space," he responded calmly. "Well, it is too close to my area," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "I can feel it." The physics of the claim were impossible. His leg was not within a foot of her seat area. But Devon recognized the real issue was not about physical space. He had encountered this before. "I apologize if it made you uncomfortable," he said, his voice level. "I was just stretching my knee briefly. I injured it recently." Judith's eyes narrowed. "People like you always think they own everything. I paid for my seat, and I'm entitled to enjoy it without being disturbed." The phrase hung in the air between them. People like you. 3 words that created an instant division, a classification, an othering. Devon felt the familiar cold knot forming in his stomach. Not of anger, but of recognition. This was not about his leg. This was never about his leg. A flash of memory invaded his thoughts. Standing in the executive lounge of the Peninsula Hotel, in Hong Kong, platinum membership card in hand, the concierge's dismissive voice. "Sir, this area is for executive members only." The same tone, the same assumption, the same instant categorization based on appearance rather than fact. That day, he had had no recording, no evidence beyond his word against the staff members. Never again, he had promised himself. "I am not sure what you mean by people like me," he said carefully, his tone still professional but cooler now. "I was simply stretching an injured knee. Do not try to make this into something it is not," Judith said, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that somehow carried even further than her previous complaints. "You know exactly what I am talking about. You people always do this. Play the victim when someone calls out your behavior." Across the aisle, Tyler Ramirez shifted uncomfortably. He glanced from Judith to Devon, then down at his hands. The tension was palpable, and something about the exchange was striking him as profoundly wrong. He had witnessed similar scenes before. His mother, a house cleaner from El Salvador, had often faced such thinly veiled prejudice. The recognition of it made his skin prickle with anxiety and a growing sense of moral discomfort. His right leg bounced rapidly under his tray table, a nervous habit he had had since childhood. Devon did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. Years of navigating similar situations had taught him that emotional reactions, however justified, would only reinforce pre-existing narratives. "I am not playing any role, Ms. Ellison," he said, using her name, which he had noticed on her luggage tag. "I am simply trying to make this flight comfortable for everyone, including myself." The use of her name startled her. The calm rationality of his response seemed to frustrate her further. She had expected, perhaps wanted, a different reaction. She huffed audibly and turned slightly away, muttering just loud enough to be heard. "This is why I usually fly first class. The quality of passengers has really declined." Devon returned to his tablet, but his focus was broken. He was acutely aware that the microphone on his headphone cable had captured the entire exchange. He touched his phone briefly, confirming the recording was continuing. His movements were subtle, practiced nothing that would draw attention. The initial spark had been lit, and somewhere deep in his professional mind, Devon knew this was likely just the beginning. The tension might have dissipated had Judith been content to leave the matter settled. But 20 minutes later, as Devon shifted again to alleviate his knee discomfort, she immediately raised her hand, pressing the flight attendant call button with deliberate force. The chime echoed through the cabin. Miranda Parker appeared within moments, her professional smile in place. "How can I help you?" she asked, her attention focused on Judith. "This man," Judith gestured sharply toward Devon without looking at him, "keeps invading my space with his leg. I have asked him to stop, but he continues to do it. It is making me very uncomfortable." Miranda's gaze shifted to Devon, her expression cooling noticeably. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. The slight narrowing of eyes, the tightening of her smile, the shift in her posture from welcoming to wary. "Sir, is there a problem?" she asked, her tone markedly different from how she had addressed Judith. "No problem," Devon replied calmly. "I injured my knee recently and was stretching it slightly into the aisle, not into anyone's personal space. I have been careful not to disturb other passengers." Judith cut in before Miranda could respond. "He is being aggressive about it. When I asked him to stop, he got confrontational." Devon blinked in genuine surprise. Nothing in their interaction could reasonably be characterized as aggressive or confrontational on his part. He opened his mouth to correct this misrepresentation, but Miranda was already nodding in response to Judith. "I understand, ma'am," she said, her voice softening with sympathy. "That must be very distressing for you." She turned back to Devon, her expression now firmly set in authority mode. "Sir, we need all passengers to keep their limbs within their allocated seat space. It is both a safety issue and a courtesy to others." "My leg was in the aisle, not in her space." Devon clarified, his voice still even. "And I was not aggressive or confrontational in any way. I simply explained that I was stretching an injured knee." Miranda's posture stiffened slightly. "Sir, I need you to comply with aircraft regulations. If you are having trouble staying within your seating area, perhaps we should find you another seat where you would be more comfortable." The implied threat was not subtle. Being moved from premium economy to a less desirable seat would be both embarrassing and uncomfortable. It was a disproportionate response to a non-issue, and they all knew it. "That will not be necessary. My rights are not negotiable." Devon's voice carried steel beneath the professional veneer. "My leg was briefly extended into the public aisle space, not into anyone's seat." "Well, it is clearly causing distress to other passengers," Miranda replied, gesturing toward Judith, who had assumed an expression of exaggerated discomfort. "If this continues to be an issue, I will have to involve the captain." The escalation was both swift and disproportionate, from a momentary stretch of a leg to the threat of captain involvement. Devon recognized the pattern. He had seen it before. The automatic assumption of his guilt, the immediate validation of the white passenger's complaint, the swift move to position him as problematic. Beneath his composed exterior, Devon felt a moment of deep weariness. For a fraction of a second, he wondered if the constant vigilance, the recording, the preparation for these inevitable confrontations was worth the emotional toll. But the alternative, allowing these moments to pass unchallenged, undocumented, was unacceptable. The recording continued, a silent witness to what was unfolding. "I understand," he said, his voice now controlled and deliberate. He made eye contact with Miranda, holding her gaze slightly longer than was comfortable. "Everything that is happening right now is being documented." The statement was factual, not threatening. His recording device was legally capturing a conversation in a public space. But something in his calm certainty seemed to give Miranda pause. She hesitated for a moment before offering a tight smile. "Enjoy the rest of your flight," she said, though her tone carried no warmth. To Judith, she added with genuine solicitude, "Please do not hesitate to call if you need anything else at all." As Miranda walked away, Devon felt a mixture of emotions. The familiar frustration, yes, but also a cold strategic focus. Each word, each tone shift, each microaggression was now preserved in digital form. The evidence was accumulating across the aisle. Tyler had witnessed the entire exchange. He had heard Judith's exaggerated claims, had seen the immediate shift in Miranda's demeanor, had noticed the automatic presumption of Devon's guilt. Something uncomfortable twisted in his stomach, not just witnessing injustice, but his own silence in its face. His hands fidgeted with his phone, turning it over repeatedly, a nervous habit that signaled his internal conflict. Devon returned to his tablet, his posture giving nothing away. But internally, he had shifted from passenger to documentarian. This flight had become more than transportation. It was now a case study in how prejudice operated at 35,000 feet. The drink cart's approach was heralded by its distinctive rattle, Miranda Parker, pushing it methodically up the aisle. Devon finished his email and closed his tablet, preparing for the service interruption. He watched with professional interest as Miranda reached the row ahead of his, noting the subtle shifts in her demeanor as she interacted with different passengers. "Something to drink?" she asked the woman in 11C, her tone pleasant but neutral. "Just water, please," the woman replied and received her drink with a polite nod from Miranda. When the cart reached Devon's row, Miranda turned first to Judith, her demeanor transforming entirely. Her smile widened. Her eyes crinkled at the corners, her body language opened up, subtle shifts that communicated genuine warmth rather than professional courtesy. "What can I get for you today, Ms. Ellison?" she asked, her voice lilting with a friendliness absent in her previous interactions. Judith straightened in her seat, basking in the attention. "I would love a white wine, dear. Do you have any Chardonnay? We have a lovely California Chardonnay today," Miranda confirmed, already reaching for a miniature bottle. "Would you like some ice with that?" "No ice, thank you," Judith replied. "And perhaps those delightful little cookies if you have them." Of course, Miranda beamed, placing not just one, but 2 packages of premium cookies on Judith's tray alongside her perfectly poured wine. "Just let me know if you need anything else at all." The contrast, when Miranda finally turned to Devon, was stark and unmistakable. Her smile disappeared, replaced by a flat professional mask. Her posture closed her eyes, avoided direct contact, her entire manner communicating a desire to complete this interaction as quickly as possible. "Drink." The single word was curt utilitarian. "Sparkling water, please," Devon replied evenly. Miranda grabbed a can and plastic cup, placing them on his tray table with minimal care. The can clattered against the plastic, nearly tipping over. No offer of cookies, no pleasantries, no eye contact. She had already begun to turn back toward the cart when Devon spoke again. "Excuse me, could I have some cookies as well, please?" His tone remained polite, revealing nothing of his awareness of the disparate treatment. Miranda paused, then reached for a single cookie package, dropping it onto his tray without comment, before promptly turning to Tyler across the aisle. Her demeanor shifted again, not as warm as with Judith, but considerably more pleasant than her interaction with Devon. "What would you like to drink, sir?" she asked Tyler with a professional smile. Just a ginger ale, please," Tyler responded, his eyes darting briefly toward Devon, then back to Miranda. He had noticed the difference in treatment. The realization made him uncomfortable, stirring something in his conscience. Devon took a sip of his sparkling water, his expression unchanged. But inside his mind was cataloging each interaction, each shift in tone, each difference in service. The microphone continued its silent work, capturing what many passengers might miss or dismiss. The subtle cadence of privilege and prejudice, playing out in miniature. Beside him, Judith sipped her wine with evident satisfaction, occasionally glancing at Devon with poorly concealed disdain. During a moment when Miranda was occupied further down the aisle, she leaned slightly toward him. "The service on this airline used to be so much better," she remarked, her voice pitched to reach him without carrying too far, before they had to hire just anybody to meet quotas. Devon met her gaze calmly. "I find that competence rarely correlates with demographics," he replied, his voice neutral but pointed, though treatment often does. Judith's eyes narrowed at his response. She had not expected articulate pushback, had perhaps anticipated angry defensiveness or silent acceptance. She turned away with a dismissive humph returning to her magazine. Meanwhile, just 2 rows ahead, Judith spotted a familiar face. An older white gentleman in an expensive suit who appeared to be a business traveler like herself. She immediately brightened, leaning forward to catch his attention. Richard. What a delightful surprise. She called out, her voice suddenly warm and melodious. Are you heading to the conference too? The man turned, taking a moment to place her. Judith. Yes, the Tech Investment Summit. Did not expect to see you here. Their conversation bloomed with immediate camaraderie, Judith laughing at his mild jokes, offering effusive compliments about his recent work. It was a stark contrast to her cold hostility toward Devon. Same cabin, same flight, entirely different Judith. The transformation was complete and instantaneous. From suspicious vigilance to warm collegiality in the space of seconds. Across the aisle, Tyler took a decision. He pulled out his phone and, under the pretense of checking messages, opened his camera app. He did not begin recording video. That would be too obvious. But he positioned the phone to capture the next interaction, his thumb hovering over the button. Something told him this might matter later. His usual anxious energy had transformed into focused attention, his leg no longer bouncing, but still his gaze sharp and observant. Meanwhile, several rows back, another passenger had been observing the interactions with growing concern. Lisa Garza, 35. A marketing executive returning from a conference, had a clear line of sight to Devon's row. With a background in corporate diversity initiatives, she recognized the patterns of discriminatory treatment unfolding before her. She made a mental note to keep watching her professional training, making her a particularly astute observer. Lisa had a habit of twisting her wedding ring when concentrating deeply, and it now spun rapidly around her finger as she analyzed the interactions playing out before her. As the drink service continued, Devon maintained his composed exterior. But his phone continued recording, capturing each interaction, each tone shift, each microaggression. The evidence was accumulating, one drink service at a time. 2 hours into the flight, Devon needed to use the restroom. His knee had stiffened during the prolonged sitting, and he knew movement would help. He closed his laptop, unbuckled his seatbelt, and turned politely toward Judith. "Excuse me," he said, his tone professionally courteous. "I need to step out." Judith looked up from her magazine, her expression immediately transforming to one of exaggerated inconvenience. She sighed dramatically, making no immediate move to let him pass. "I just got comfortable," she complained loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Cannot you wait until I finish this article?" Devon maintained his composure. "I am sorry, but I really do need to use the restroom now." With another theatrical sigh, Judith made a show of gathering her belongings, adjusting her seat, and finally standing. A process she stretched to maximum inconvenience. As Devon carefully edged past her into the aisle, being meticulously careful not to make contact, she pulled back as if anticipating unwanted touch. "Some people have no consideration for others," she announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "It is always about their needs, their convenience." Devon said nothing, moving toward the lavatory, with measured steps, conscious of his slight limp from the knee injury. He was aware of eyes on him, some curious, some indifferent, some already influenced by Judith's performance. Tyler watched the interaction with growing discomfort. The woman's behavior seemed deliberately provocative, designed to create an incident rather than respond to one. He glanced around, wondering if others saw what he was seeing. His right hand tapped an anxious rhythm against his thigh. Not the bouncing leg from earlier, but a new manifestation of his growing distress at the situation. When Devon returned from the lavatory a few minutes later, he found Miranda standing near his row, engaged in quiet conversation with Judith. Their posture suggested intimacy, shared confidence. As he approached, he caught the tail end of Miranda's statement, "Keep an eye on him for you." Both women looked up as he neared Judith, with poorly concealed hostility. Miranda, with professional coolness that did not reach her eyes. Devon nodded politely to both as he waited for Judith to let him back to his seat. Once again, Judith made the process as cumbersome as possible, muttering under her breath about constant disruptions and inconsiderate people. Devon maintained his dignified silence, settling back into his seat, without acknowledging the provocation. As Miranda moved away, she paused by Devon's seat. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying a note of warning. "Several passengers have mentioned feeling uncomfortable with your movements in the cabin. I would appreciate it if you could remain seated as much as possible for the remainder of the flight." The statement was as false as it was transparent. No other passengers had complained. Only Judith had expressed any issue with his entirely normal use of the aircraft lavatory. Devon looked directly into Miranda's eyes, his gaze steady. "I have only left my seat once to use the restroom," he stated calmly. "That is hardly excessive movement, and I have the same right as any passenger to access the facilities when needed." Miranda's lips tightened. "I am simply asking you to be considerate of other passengers' comfort." "I am always considerate," Devon replied, his voice even but firm. "And I am fully aware of which passenger's comfort you are prioritizing." Something in his direct gaze made Miranda shift slightly, a flash of uncertainty crossing her features. She was accustomed to passengers backing down immediately when confronted with authority. Devon's calm assertion and clear articulation did not fit her expectation. "Just please stay in your seat," she repeated, then turned away, moving quickly back toward the galley. Across the aisle, Tyler had captured a photo of Miranda and Judith's whispered conference. He was not sure why he felt compelled to document this, only that something about the situation felt profoundly wrong. His usual anxiety about his upcoming interview had been replaced by a new focus, a sense of bearing witness to something that should not be ignored. A few rows back, Lisa Garza had also witnessed the entire exchange. Her background in corporate anti-discrimination training had trained her to recognize exactly what was unfolding. She made a decision standing up and walking toward the rear lavatory, timing her return to pass by Devon's seat. As she passed, she paused briefly, pretending to steady herself on the seat in front of him. "I see what is happening," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "It is not right." The slight accent in her voice, Texas with hints of her Mexican heritage, became more pronounced in the whispered exchange, a detail she typically tried to minimize in professional settings but emerged in moments of emotion. Devon gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, but said nothing. He did not know this woman could not be sure of her intentions or reliability as a potential witness. Years of navigating similar situations had taught him to trust documentation over declarations of allyship. As he settled back with his tablet, Devon subtly checked his phone, confirming the ongoing recording. Miranda's words, "Keep an eye on him," were now preserved digital evidence of the alliance forming against him of assumptions made based not on his behavior, but on his appearance. Phase 1 complete, he thought to himself, mentally cataloging the evidence gathered so far. Documentation secured. The bathroom incident had escalated the situation in ways both visible and invisible. The battle lines were being drawn across the cabin of Flight 653. The next hour brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the cabin's atmosphere. From her seat in 12B, Judith had launched a quiet campaign of influence, engaging passengers within earshot in hushed conversations that invariably included glances in Devon's direction. "Made me feel so uncomfortable." Fragments of her narrative drifted to nearby rows. "You know how they can be when challenged," to an elderly couple across the aisle. "Flight attendant is keeping an eye on the situation." Reassurance to a nervous-looking woman in 11A. Devon observed this social contagion with detached professional interest, even as he recognized its potential impact. Judith was creating a narrative where he was not merely an individual passenger, but a representative of a group, a potential threat, rather than a fellow traveler. It was a familiar pattern, one he had witnessed and documented throughout his career. Miranda reinforced this narrative with her own behavior. Her frequent passes through the cabin always included a watchful glance at Devon, her body language signaling vigilance rather than service. When she stopped to check on passengers, she lingered longest with Judith, their conversations just below normal speaking volume, their shared glances toward Devon unsubtle. The social dynamics were shifting in real time. Some passengers, influenced by the repeated suggestions of concern, began to regard Devon with wary glances. Others, observing the situation more critically, showed signs of discomfort with the emerging dynamic. Lisa Garza had returned to her seat, but maintained occasional eye contact with Devon, her expression communicating recognition of the injustice unfolding. Tyler Ramirez had grown increasingly uncomfortable, his attention divided between his interview preparation materials and the troubling interactions playing out beside him. The financial equations he had been muttering earlier had stopped, completely replaced by a focused attention to the drama unfolding in the cabin. Devon maintained his composed exterior, focusing on his work, occasionally sipping his water. His posture revealed nothing of his awareness of the social maneuvering happening around him. But the microphone continued its silent documentation, capturing the whispers, the tones, the subtle sounds of prejudice gaining momentum. Midway through this hour, the situation gained another dimension when a second flight attendant appeared in the cabin. Michael Rodriguez, 30, moved through the aisle with professional efficiency, collecting trash from passengers. His movements were quick but precise, his perpetually cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to Miranda's carefully modulated authority. Where she projected control, he radiated genuine warmth, a difference passengers unconsciously responded to. When he reached Devon's row, Miranda suddenly appeared as if materializing from thin air. "I have got this section, Michael," she said, her tone pleasant but firm. "You can focus on the rear cabin." Michael glanced at her, then at Devon, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. "I am almost done with this section," he replied, his slight Spanish accent becoming more pronounced in moments of stress. "Just a few more rows." "I said I have got it," Miranda repeated, her voice dropping slightly, taking on an edge. "There is a situation I am handling." Michael hesitated, his gaze moving between Miranda and Devon, who was simply sitting and working on his tablet. Nothing in the scene suggested any situation requiring special handling. His eyes met Devon's briefly, and something passed between them, a moment of recognition, of understanding. "Sure," Michael finally said to Miranda, his tone carefully neutral. "I will finish up in the back." As he moved away, Michael slowed slightly as he passed Devon's seat, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Sorry about that, sir." The brief interaction did not go unnoticed by Judith, who immediately pressed her call button again. When Miranda responded, their hushed conversation included pointed glances toward Michael, retreating down the aisle. Devon absorbed this development with quiet attention. The division of the cabin was becoming clearer, those aligning with Judith's narrative and those beginning to question it. The recording captured it all: the whispers, the tone shifts, the subtle construction of a biased narrative, and the emerging resistance to it. Protocol 3 initiated. Devon thought to himself, mentally tracking the escalation and documentation. Witness identification phase beginning. Lisa Garza had witnessed the interaction between the flight attendants. As a corporate trainer on workplace bias, she recognized the pattern immediately. The establishment of an in-group and out-group, the social reinforcement of bias, the pressure to conform to a discriminatory narrative. She made another decision, standing and making her way toward the galley, where Michael had disappeared. Her wedding ring twisted rapidly around her finger as she walked. Her unconscious tell, when preparing for a difficult conversation. Tyler continued his surreptitious documentation, capturing a photo of Miranda and Judith in yet another conspiratorial conversation. He was not entirely sure why he felt compelled to do this, only that his sense of justice demanded some response to what he was witnessing. The nervous energy that had manifested in bouncing legs and tapping fingers earlier had transformed into a focused calm, the feeling of purpose displacing his anxiety. Throughout the cabin, a silent sorting was occurring, passengers aligning themselves based on their interpretation of the unfolding dynamic. Some accepted Judith and Miranda's characterization without question. Others observed more critically, recognizing the familiar patterns of prejudice at work. And at the center of it all, Devon Rhodes continued his work, his external calm masking his meticulous documentation of every interaction, every whisper, every glance. The evidence was mounting one hushed conversation at a time. 3 hours into the flight, Devon needed to retrieve his noise-canceling headphones from his carry-on in the overhead bin. The cabin had settled into a lull, many passengers dozing, others absorbed in movies or books. He checked that the seatbelt sign was off, then unbuckled, and stood carefully mindful of his knee. As he reached toward the overhead bin, Judith's reaction was immediate and dramatically disproportionate. She flinched visibly, pressing herself back in her seat, as if under threat, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture of alarm. "Oh," she exclaimed, her voice pitched to Carrie. "What are you doing? You are making me nervous." Several heads turned. Devon paused, his hand still raised toward the bin, momentarily frozen by the absurdity of her reaction to his perfectly normal movement. "I am just getting something from my bag," he explained calmly, continuing his reach toward the overhead compartment. "He keeps jumping up and down," Judith announced to the cabin at large. "I do not feel safe with him looming over me like this." The characterization was so divorced from reality. Devon had stood only once previously during the entire flight, that for a moment he wondered if she was experiencing some kind of delusion. But the calculated nature of her performance, the strategic timing of her complaints, suggested something far more deliberate. Miranda appeared with remarkable speed, as if she had been hovering nearby, waiting for just such an opportunity. Her expression was stern, her posture rigid with authority. "Sir, what seems to be the problem?" Now she demanded, her tone making it clear who she presumed was at fault. "There is no problem," Devon replied evenly. "I stood to retrieve something from my bag in the overhead bin. The seatbelt sign is off." He jumped up so suddenly, Judith interjected, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "It startled me terribly. I do not feel safe." Miranda turned to Judith with immediate concern. "I am so sorry you are feeling unsafe, Ms. Ellison. That is completely unacceptable." She turned back to Devon, her expression hardening. "Sir, this is the third incident. You are clearly disturbing other passengers. I am afraid I will need to ask you to move to another seat, or we will have to consider other measures." The threat hung in the air. Other measures clearly implying potential involvement of air marshals or law enforcement upon landing. It was a dramatic escalation from the simple act of a passenger accessing his own belongings in an overhead bin. Devon slowly lowered his hand, his expression controlled, but his eyes reflecting a cold clarity. He met Miranda's gaze directly. "My dignity is not negotiable. My patience is." Each word landed like a gavel. "I have done nothing wrong. I have violated no regulations. I have accessed the overhead bin exactly once during this flight, which is every passenger's right." The measured control of his response seemed to unsettle Miranda slightly. She had expected either angry defensiveness or immediate compliance. His calm articulation of the facts disrupted her script. Nevertheless, she persisted, though, with slightly less certainty. "If your movements are making other passengers uncomfortable, his existence is what is making her uncomfortable," came a new voice. Tyler Ramirez had stood up, his phone visible in his hand. "I have been watching this whole flight. He has not done anything wrong. Not once." The unexpected intervention created a ripple of reaction through nearby rows. Miranda turned to Tyler, clearly surprised by this challenge to her authority. "Sir, please stay out of this. It does not concern you. Actually, it concerns everyone on this flight," Lisa Garza said, appearing from a few rows back. "When one passenger is treated differently, based on appearance rather than behavior, it affects all of us." Her professional training was evident in her clear, authoritative tone, the voice she used in corporate seminars when establishing key points. Miranda's composure visibly faltered as she found herself suddenly facing not just Devon, but multiple passengers questioning her actions. "I am simply responding to a passenger's concerns." "Selective concerns," Lisa countered firmly. "I have been watching too. He has gotten up exactly once before this to use the restroom, like every other passenger on this flight." Devon remained standing, his presence calm but unmovable. I am going to retrieve my headphones from my bag, he stated, not as a request, but as a simple fact. Then I will return to my seat. This is my right as a passenger who has paid for this flight. With deliberate movements, he opened the bin, retrieved his headphones, and closed the compartment. Then he sat down, his movements unhurried and dignified. The entire interaction had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it had fundamentally altered the dynamic in the cabin. Miranda found herself at a crossroads. Her authority publicly questioned, her bias exposed. She retreated slightly. Just, please remain in your seat as much as possible for the remainder of the flight, she said, her tone less commanding now. I will use this flight's amenities exactly as I am entitled to, Devon replied evenly. No more, no less. As Miranda walked away, her posture stiff with thwarted authority, murmurs spread through nearby rows. The confrontation had forced other passengers to take sides to evaluate what they had witnessed. Many had seen the disconnect between Judith's dramatic reactions and Devon's actual behavior. The narrative she and Miranda had been constructing began to fray at the edges. Tyler sat down, his phone still in hand. He had captured the entire exchange. Judith's manufactured distress, Miranda's immediate assumption of Devon's guilt, the disproportionate threat of other measures. He caught Devon's eye across the aisle and gave a small nod of solidarity. For the first time since boarding, Tyler's anxious fidgeting had completely stopped. His shoulders were set with new purpose, his gaze clear and direct. Devon nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of the unexpected alliance. He put on his headphones, outwardly returning to his work. But inside, he was keenly aware that a significant shift had occurred. The isolated target had found allies. The documentation now extended beyond his own recording to include independent witnesses. The power dynamic had begun to change, and with it, the trajectory of Flight 653's journey toward justice. In the aftermath of the overhead bin confrontation, a subtle reorganization occurred throughout the cabin of Flight 653. What had been individual discomfort with the treatment of Devon Rhodes crystallized into a loose network of alert observers. The confrontation had forced a choice: accept the narrative promoted by Judith and Miranda, or question it based on the evidence of their own eyes. Lisa Garza waited for a moment when Miranda was occupied in the galley, then moved to the empty seat beside Tyler Ramirez. Her introduction was brief and purposeful. I am Lisa, corporate diversity trainer, she said quietly, extending her hand. Her silver bracelet, engraved with Speak Truth to Power, caught the cabin light. What we are seeing is textbook discriminatory behavior. Tyler nodded, his expression a mixture of discomfort and resolve. I know. I have been taking photos. It is not right. His voice, which had been hesitant and nervous earlier, now carried conviction. Lisa glanced toward Devon, who was working on his tablet, headphones on. Has he said anything to you? No, Tyler replied. He has just been dignified, professional, despite everything. Their conversation was interrupted when Miranda emerged from the galley, her gaze immediately landing on Lisa, in the seat that was not hers. Ma'am, I need you to return to your assigned seat, she called out, moving quickly toward them. FAA regulations require passengers to remain in their ticketed seats during flight. This was not, in fact, an FAA regulation. Passengers were permitted to change seats after takeoff, provided the aircraft was not at capacity. But Miranda's tone brooked no argument. Lisa stood smoothly. Of course. Just stretching my legs. As she passed Devon's row, she dropped a business card onto his tray table, the movement subtle but deliberate. Devon glanced at the card, then tucked it into his jacket pocket without comment. The brief interaction did not go unnoticed by Judith, who immediately leaned toward Miranda when she approached. They are conspiring, she said loudly enough for Devon to hear despite his headphones. I told you he was trouble. Miranda nodded, her expression concerned. I am keeping a close eye on the situation, Ms. Ellison. Do not worry. Meanwhile, Michael Rodriguez had been observing from the rear galley. As a relatively new flight attendant, he had initially deferred to Miranda's seniority and experience. But what he had witnessed over the past hours conflicted with both his training and his personal ethics. After a moment of consideration, he made his way forward, timing his movement to intersect with Lisa returning to her seat. "Ma'am," he said, professional but quiet. "Could I offer you a water?" It was a pretext, and they both knew it. As he handed her the bottled water, he spoke in a low voice. "I have seen what is happening. It is against company policy and my own principles. I have documented the time and nature of the incidents in my service log." His fingers tapped twice against his pocket, where he kept his small notebook, a habit his grandmother had called confirming truth with touch. Lisa looked at him with newfound respect. That was brave. Michael shook his head slightly. That was basic human decency. He continued his way forward, stopping briefly at Devon's row. "Can I get you anything, sir?" he asked, his tone deliberately equal to how he had addressed other passengers. "I am fine, thank you," Devon replied, noting the subtle statement being made in this normal courteous service. "Let me know if you need anything at all," Michael emphasized, then continued forward, passing Miranda, who watched the interaction with narrowed eyes. The alliances were forming, not through explicit coordination, but through individual recognitions of injustice and decisions to act. Tyler with his photographic evidence, Lisa with her professional expertise in identifying discrimination, Michael with his internal documentation and willingness to break ranks with a senior colleague. Devon observed these developments with cautious optimism. Throughout his career, he had learned that documentation was essential, but often insufficient. Witness testimony, particularly from those who had no prior connection to him, added crucial weight to evidence of discriminatory treatment. Secondary documentation confirmed. Witness network established. He noted mentally continuing his systematic approach to the unfolding situation, preparing for potential escalation. The dynamic shifted further when an elderly man from the row behind Judith leaned forward. He had been listening to her increasingly dramatic retelling of events to anyone who would listen, and his patience had apparently reached its limit. "Young lady," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his years, "I have been sitting here the entire flight. That gentleman has not done a single thing wrong that I have seen. Maybe you should focus on your magazine instead of creating problems." The veteran's weathered hands, steady despite his age, gripped the seat back firmly as he spoke, his military bearings still evident decades after service. Judith turned to him affronted. "You do not understand. I feel threatened." The elderly man raised a bushy eyebrow. "I fought in Vietnam. I know what a threat looks like. That ain't it." This unexpected intervention from a passenger Judith had likely assumed would be sympathetic to her narrative created another crack in the foundation of bias she and Miranda had been building. Several nearby passengers, who had been watching the situation unfold, exchanged glances, reassessing their perceptions. Devon remained focused on his work, apparently absorbed in his tablet. But his awareness extended throughout the cabin, noting each shift in alliance, each new observer who moved from passive witness to active questioning. The recording continued, capturing not just the overt confrontations, but the subtle realignments occurring throughout the flight. The battle lines had been drawn, but they were not where Judith and Miranda had intended them to be. What had begun as an attempt to isolate and control had instead created a coalition of conscience that spanned the cabin of Flight 653. The meal service began 4 hours into the flight. Flight attendants emerged from the galley with trolleys of pre-packaged meals, the familiar routine of airline dining unfolding row by row. Michael Rodriguez handled the rear section of the cabin, while Miranda Parker took charge of the forward section, including Devon's row. The pattern established during drink service continued with heightened contrast. Miranda presented Judith's meal with a flourish, taking time to explain the options, ensuring her napkin was properly placed, offering extra bread and a refill of her wine. "The chicken is particularly good today," Ms. Ellison Miranda advised, with a warm smile. "And I have set aside an extra dessert for you." Her movements were fluid and accommodating, creating an atmosphere of personal service rather than standard meal distribution. When she turned to Devon, the transformation was stark. She placed his meal tray down with visible carelessness, the plastic container sliding across the tray. The sound of hard plastic against the tray table cut through the ambient cabin noise. "Chicken or pasta?" she stated flatly, no question in her tone. "Chicken, please," Devon replied evenly. She thrust the chicken meal toward him without comment, already turning away when Devon spoke again. "Excuse me, could I have a napkin, please?" His tone remained polite, revealing nothing of his awareness of the disparate treatment. Miranda turned back, dropping a napkin onto his tray without meeting his eyes. As she adjusted her position to serve Tyler across the aisle, her elbow swung back, knocking Devon's cup of water directly into his lap. The cold liquid spread across his trousers instantly, a dark stain blooming across the expensive fabric. Devon stood reflexively, the sudden wetness startling him into movement. Judith immediately pressed herself back in her seat with an exaggerated gasp of alarm. "He is standing again!" she exclaimed, her voice carrying through the cabin. After being told repeatedly to stay seated, Miranda turned, taking in the situation with a glance, her expression showing no remorse for the spill she had caused. "Sir, please return to your seat immediately," she ordered, her tone sharp. "You have spilled water all over me," Devon stated, his voice level but firm. "I need to dry off." "It was clearly an accident," Miranda replied dismissively. "Please sit down. Your continued disruption is disturbing other passengers." It was the breaking point, the moment when the accumulated weight of small injustices crystallized into something undeniable. The deliberate spill, the immediate blame reversal, the complete absence of basic courtesy, all captured in his recording, all witnessed by surrounding passengers. Lisa Garza stood up from her seat, her professional training in managing discriminatory incidents overtaking her role as mere passenger. "That is enough," she said, her voice carrying the authority of expertise. "This has gone beyond poor service into clear discrimination. He has every right to address being soaked by a spill you caused." Miranda turned to her affronted. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. This does not concern you." "It concerns everyone on this flight," Lisa countered. "What we are witnessing is a pattern of targeted differential treatment based on protected characteristics. As a certified corporate anti-discrimination trainer, I am documenting this incident." Her wedding ring had stopped spinning. In moments of professional clarity, Lisa became perfectly still, her gestures precise and minimal. Tyler Ramirez had begun openly recording with his phone, no longer attempting to be discreet. "I have got it all," he confirmed, his earlier nervousness replaced by quiet determination. The spill was deliberate. It is clear in the video. Judith's performance escalated, her voice rising with theatrical distress. "I do not feel safe. There is a disruption. These people are ganging up on the flight attendant." Devon remained standing, his pants soaked, his expression composed, but resolute. "I need napkins to dry myself," he stated simply. "And I need acknowledgement that this spill was caused by the flight attendant, not by me." Miranda's face flushed with a mixture of anger and dawning realization that the situation was slipping from her control. Multiple passengers were now openly watching, some with phones raised. The narrative she had attempted to construct, of Devon as the problem passenger, was unraveling visibly. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You are making a scene over a simple accident." "There was nothing accidental about it," came a new voice. Michael Rodriguez had approached from the rear galley, his expression serious. "I saw the entire interaction. The spill was avoidable, at minimum deliberate at worst." Miranda turned to him, her expression hardening. "You are out of line, Rodriguez. Return to your station." Michael stood his ground. "No, you are out of line. This violates Atlantic Airlines Non-Discrimination Policy Section 4.3, which I am required to uphold as a condition of my employment." His usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by professional resolve, his notebook now openly in hand rather than tucked away. The specific policy citation caught Miranda off guard. She had not expected her junior colleague to directly challenge her authority with such precision. Devon spoke again, his voice calm, but carrying clearly through the now silent section of the cabin. "I would like napkins to dry myself. An incident report filed about this spill, and the name and employee number of this flight attendant." The reasonable specific requests highlighted the professionalism of his response compared to Miranda's increasingly defensive posture. Several passengers nodded in agreement with his handling of the situation. Miranda found herself cornered multiple witnesses, now openly contradicting her characterization of events. She grabbed a handful of napkins from her cart and thrust them toward Devon without meeting his eyes. "My name is on my badge," she said stiffly. "You can file whatever complaint you want." "I will," Devon assured her, his tone matter-of-fact rather than threatening. "Along with the audio recording of this entire flight that I have been making since boarding." The statement landed like a thunderclap in the cabin. Miranda's head snapped up, her eyes widening as the implications registered. The color drained from her face as the realization hit her. Every dismissive word, every biased action, every lie was preserved in perfect digital clarity. Her hand still holding napkins froze in midair. Judith went suddenly still, her performance of distress forgotten in the shock of this revelation. "You have been recording." Miranda managed her voice suddenly stripped of all authority, a tremor of fear replacing her previous confidence. Her shoulders, previously squared with authority, now hunched slightly, as if physically trying to withdraw from the situation. Every word Devon confirmed, dabbing at his soaked pants with the napkins. Every interaction, every discriminatory comment, every differential treatment, all documented for appropriate review. The balance of power shifted visibly in that moment. What Miranda and Judith had assumed was an isolated target, someone they could marginalize with impunity, had revealed himself as a prepared professional, who had been methodically documenting their behavior from the start. That is invasion of privacy," Judith sputtered, her confident indignation crumbling into panic as she mentally replayed everything she had said. Her manicured nails, which had been tapping imperiously against her armrest throughout the flight, now clutched her handbag with white-knuckled intensity. "Not in a public space like an airplane cabin," Lisa Garza interjected. "Single-party consent recording is legal on commercial flights." Tyler raised his phone slightly. "And I have been recording too since the overhead bin incident. Multiple angles, multiple witnesses." The nervous energy that had characterized him earlier had completely transformed. He stood straight, his voice steady. Miranda took an involuntary step back, the cart rattling slightly with her movement. Her hands trembled as she gripped the trolley handle for support. The realization dawning across her face was unmistakable. She had been exposed, her actions preserved irrefutably, her bias documented beyond denial. Devon remained standing, napkins in hand, his dignity intact despite his soaked clothing. He had not raised his voice, had not lost control, had not fulfilled any of the stereotypes Judith and Miranda had attempted to project onto him. Instead, he had revealed himself as the most prepared person in the cabin, a professional who had anticipated and documented the very bias being directed against him. "I suggest," he said quietly, "that we all return to our seats and complete this flight without further incident. The evidence has been collected. What happens next will be determined on the ground." It was a turning point from which there was no return. The recording had transformed what might have been dismissed as subjective perception into documented fact. The power dynamic had inverted completely, and everyone in the cabin knew it. The revelation of Devon's recording created an immediate ripple effect throughout the cabin. Passengers who had been half aware of the unfolding situation now became fully engaged witnesses. The atmosphere shifted palpably as the implications registered. Everything that had happened was preserved not as malleable memory, but as unalterable documentation. Miranda Parker stood frozen for a moment, her professional mask cracking under the weight of this new reality. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its authoritative edge. "Recording other passengers without consent is perfectly legal in public spaces," Devon completed calmly. "And commercial airline cabins are public spaces. I am not recording private conversations Just my own interactions in a shared environment. Several passengers nodded in agreement. A man in a business suit 3 rows up spoke up. He is right. I am an attorney. Single-party recording is legal on commercial flights. The man's authoritative tone, that of someone accustomed to courtroom declarations, added weight to his statement. Miranda turned to him, her composure further fracturing. This is an internal airline matter. It became a legal matter the moment you engaged in discriminatory behavior, the attorney countered. And I would advise you to be very careful what you say next. He adjusted his tie as he spoke, a courtroom habit that signaled the transition from casual observer to professional advocate. Judith Ellison, seeing her ally faltering, attempted to regain control of the narrative. He has been threatening me this entire flight. I do not feel safe with him recording me. Tyler Ramirez, still recording with his phone, turned slightly to capture her performance. Ma'am, I have been sitting across from you both for 4 hours. He has not spoken to you except when necessary, has not moved, except to use the restroom once and access his bag once. Your claims are simply not factual. You do not understand, Judith insisted, her voice rising with desperation. His presence is threatening. The way he looks at me. Is the issue his looks or his looks? Lisa Garza interrupted pointedly, the deliberate emphasis making the subtext explicit. Because, from where I am sitting, the only threatening behavior has been coming from you and the flight attendant. The directness of the challenge silenced Judith momentarily. She glanced around, seeking allies among the other passengers, but found mostly averted eyes or openly skeptical expressions. The coalition she had attempted to build through whispered insinuations was dissolving in the face of documented reality. Miranda, recognizing her increasingly precarious position, attempted to reassert control. She turned to Tyler, her expression hardening. Sir, I need you to stop recording immediately. It is causing distress to another passenger. Tyler did not lower his phone. I am documenting a situation where discrimination is occurring. That is my right as a passenger. I can have you removed from this flight when we land. Miranda threatened, though her tone lacked conviction, for what Tyler challenged. Recording evidence of bias. I do not think your airline's legal team would support that position. The confidence in his voice was new. His earlier anxiety replaced by certainty of purpose. His glasses, which he had nervously adjusted throughout the flight, now sat firmly in place, no longer a focus of his fidgeting. Michael Rodriguez stepped forward again, his decision apparently made. Miranda, this needs to stop. What you are doing violates our training, our company policies, and my personal ethics. I am not going to stand by and be complicit. Miranda turned to him, betrayal flashing across her features. You are taking their side against a fellow crew member. I am taking the side of professional conduct and equal treatment, Michael replied firmly. This is not about sides. It is about doing our job correctly. His service notebook was now open in his hand, his detailed documentation of the incidents visible to anyone nearby. The public confrontation had now expanded beyond Devon and Miranda to include multiple passengers and crew members. What had begun as isolated incidents of bias had evolved into a cabin-wide reckoning with accountability. Devon, still standing with napkins in hand, spoke again, his voice measured but carrying clearly. I am going to return to my seat now. I would like dry clothing for my carry-on, and I expect no further interference with my normal passenger activities for the remainder of this flight. He moved to access the overhead bin, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Miranda made no move to stop him, this time the earlier threats of other measures conspicuously absent, now that her actions were being openly recorded and challenged. Judith, however, was not ready to concede. As Devon reached for his bag, she made one last desperate attempt to salvage her narrative. He is threatening me, she exclaimed, shrinking back in her seat with exaggerated fear. Someone help. The performance fell flat. The disconnect between her claims and the reality visible to everyone, Devon calmly retrieving clothing from his own bag, was too stark to ignore. Several passengers exchanged glances of disbelief or outright scorn. Ma'am, said the elderly veteran from the row behind. "The only person disturbing this flight is you. Maybe it is time to be quiet and read your magazine." His weathered hands gestured toward her magazine, with the directness of someone who had seen enough real threats in his lifetime to be unimpressed by manufactured ones. A murmur of agreement spread through nearby rows. The public sentiment had shifted decisively, the accumulated evidence too compelling to dismiss. Judith's theatrical fear no longer elicited concern, but instead drew critical assessment from fellow passengers who had witnessed the entire progression of events. Devon retrieved a pair of track pants from his bag and closed the bin. "I am going to the lavatory to change out of these wet clothes," he stated, making his intentions clear to avoid any further manufactured drama. No one objected. Miranda stood by her cart, her authority effectively neutralized by the combination of recorded evidence and public opinion. The confrontation had reached its climax, and the verdict of the cabin court was evident in the expressions and postures of the assembled passengers. As Devon moved towards the lavatory, Lisa Garza caught his eye briefly. Her slight nod communicated professional recognition, one expert acknowledging another's handling of a difficult situation. Tyler continued recording, documenting this final phase of the public confrontation. The balance had shifted completely. What had begun as an attempt to isolate and control had instead exposed the very bias it sought to enforce. The power of documentation, combined with the courage of witnesses who chose to speak up, had transformed what might have been a private indignity into a public reckoning. And as Devon entered the lavatory to change his soaked clothing, the recording device continued its silent work, preserving every word, every tone, every moment of this turning point at 35,000 feet. The commotion in the cabin eventually reached the cockpit. Captain James Wilson, after receiving conflicting reports from flight attendants, made the decision to assess the situation personally. As Devon returned to his seat in dry clothing, the captain emerged from the flight deck, his presence immediately commanding attention. Captain Wilson, 55, carried himself with the calm authority that came from decades of aviation experience. His movements were measured and precise, his uniform immaculate 4 gold stripes gleaming on each sleeve. His expression was neutral, but evaluative, as he approached the center of the disturbance, his eyes taking in details with the practiced scan of a former military pilot. "What is the situation here?" he asked, his tone professional, neither accusatory nor dismissive. Miranda moved quickly to his side, speaking in a low, urgent voice. "We have a disruptive passenger, Captain. He has been aggressive, intimidating other passengers, and refusing to follow crew instructions." Devon remained seated, his posture relaxed, but attentive. He made no attempt to interrupt or contradict Miranda's characterization, his silence more powerful than any immediate defense. His hands rested calmly on the armrests, his father's Rolex catching the cabin light, a quiet symbol of heritage and achievement that contradicted the narrative being constructed about him. Tyler Ramirez spoke up from across the aisle, his phone still recording. "That is not accurate, Captain. I have been seated across from this gentleman the entire flight. He has been nothing but professional and calm, despite being subjected to discriminatory treatment." Captain Wilson turned to Tyler, taking in the recording phone with a glance. "And you are?" "Tyler Ramirez, sir. I have documented much of what has happened in the last hour." The nervous energy that had characterized Tyler at the beginning of the flight had vanished completely. He spoke with clarity and conviction, maintaining steady eye contact with the captain. Lisa Garza stood from her seat a few rows back. "I am Lisa Garza, Captain. I am a certified corporate anti-discrimination trainer. What I have witnessed on this flight is textbook differential treatment based on protected characteristics." She stood with professional poise, her silver Speak Truth to Power bracelet visible as she gestured to emphasize key points. Captain Wilson nodded acknowledgement, then looked at Michael Rodriguez, who stood nearby. "Your perspective, Mr. Rodriguez." Michael straightened slightly under the captain's direct address. "Sir, I have documented multiple incidents in my service log where this passenger," he gestured toward Devon, "received markedly different treatment than others in the same cabin. The water spill was particularly concerning. It appeared deliberate rather than accidental, and there was no apology offered. He held up his service notebook, its pages filled with time-stamped entries, his meticulous habit of documentation now serving a greater purpose than routine flight notes. The captain absorbed this information with a slight frown, then turned to Devon. "Sir, your name and version of events." "Devon Rhodes," he replied calmly. "I have experienced a pattern of discriminatory treatment throughout this flight, beginning with false accusations about my leg being in another passenger's space, escalating to threats of being moved from my ticketed seat, and culminating in having water deliberately spilled on me. I have been recording audio of these interactions since boarding, as is my legal right in a public space." The mention of recording caused Captain Wilson's eyebrows to rise slightly, but his expression remained professional. He turned to Judith, who had been uncharacteristically silent since the captain's arrival. "Ma'am, you appear to be involved in this situation." Judith attempted to summon her earlier performance of victimhood, but it lacked conviction now. "He has been intimidating, making me uncomfortable. I do not feel safe." Her manicured nails, which had tapped with such imperious confidence earlier, now twisted nervously in her lap, specifically how the captain pressed his tone neutral but insistent. Judith faltered. "Well, he kept putting his leg in my space. I was stretching an injured knee briefly into the aisle space, not into her seating area." Devon clarified. "This is documented in my recording." Captain Wilson nodded, then addressed the passengers in the surrounding rows. "Has anyone else witnessed behavior from this gentleman that seemed threatening or disruptive?" The silence was telling. No one spoke up to support Judith's claims. Instead, the elderly veteran behind her cleared his throat. "Captain, I have watched this whole situation unfold. That young man has conducted himself with remarkable restraint, given the provocations. The only disruption has come from this woman's repeated false claims and the flight attendants' enabling of them." The veteran's bearing as he spoke, spine straight, chin raised slightly, revealed his military background, creating an immediate connection with the captain that transcended words. Several passengers nodded in agreement. Captain Wilson took in the collective response, his experienced eyes scanning the cabin and reading the situation with professional assessment. He turned back to Miranda, whose earlier confidence had visibly eroded. "Ms. Parker, please return to the galley. We will discuss this further after landing." To Devon, he said, "Sir, I apologize for any discomfort you have experienced on our flight. You are welcome to remain in your assigned seat, and I assure you there will be no further issues for the remainder of the journey." The captain's intervention, with its clear acknowledgement that Devon was not the problem, effectively ended any remaining authority Miranda or Judith might have claimed. Captain Wilson turned to the cabin at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be beginning our descent into San Francisco in approximately 40 minutes. I ask that everyone return to their seats and prepare for arrival. Thank you for your cooperation." With that, he nodded to Michael Rodriguez. "Mr. Rodriguez, please take over service for this section for the remainder of the flight." As the captain returned to the cockpit, the implications of his decisions resonated throughout the cabin. By removing Miranda from service in Devon's section and explicitly apologizing to him, Captain Wilson had made his assessment of the situation clear to everyone present. Devon exchanged a brief look with the captain before he departed. A moment of professional recognition between two men accustomed to authority and responsibility. No words were necessary. The captain's actions had spoken volumes. Miranda retreated to the galley, her posture rigid with humiliation and suppressed anger. Judith sat in uncharacteristic silence, the collapse of her manufactured narrative, leaving her without a script. The passengers around them settled back into their seats. The drama concluded, but not forgotten. Tyler finally lowered his phone, though he did not stop the recording. "That was impressive," he said quietly to Devon across the aisle. "The way you handled all of this." Devon gave a small acknowledging nod. "Documentation transforms accusations into evidence," he replied simply. It changes the entire dynamic. Lisa Garza stopped by his row as she returned to her seat. "I would like to talk after we land," she said, keeping her voice low. What happened here should be formally addressed. Her wedding ring had stopped spinning entirely, a sign that her professional resolve had fully engaged. "I agree," Devon replied, "and it will be." As the flight began its final approach to San Francisco, the cabin settled into an uneasy calm. But beneath the surface, the implications of what had transpired continued to resonate. A boundary had been crossed, documented, and called to account. And the consequences would extend far beyond the confines of Flight 653. The final 30 minutes of Flight 653 unfolded in a transformed atmosphere. Michael Rodriguez had taken over service from Miranda Parker, moving through the cabin with professional courtesy that was notably equal for all passengers. The contrast with Miranda's earlier differential treatment was stark and noticed by many. His natural warmth and efficiency created a noticeable shift in the cabin atmosphere, tension giving way to normalcy. Devon Rhodes worked quietly on his tablet, his external demeanor composed despite the tension that still hung in the air. Inside, however, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, yes, but also a familiar weariness at having to document and prove what should have been basic respect. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Excellence is not enough. You must also be prepared." The recording device had been part of that preparation, a necessity he sometimes resented even as he recognized its value. Across the aisle, Tyler Ramirez had exchanged contact information with him, a brief, practical interaction acknowledging their shared experience as witnesses to the same events. Tyler's earlier anxiety had been replaced by a quiet confidence, the satisfaction of having stood up rather than remain silent. Judith Ellison remained uncharacteristically subdued, her earlier theatrical performances replaced by a rigid silence that suggested not remorse, but the recognition of exposure. Occasionally, she would glance toward Devon, her expression a complex mixture of resentment and uncertainty. Her phone remained in her purse, her social networking temporarily suspended by the uncomfortable reality of having been documented and called to account. As the aircraft began its descent into San Francisco International Airport, Captain Wilson's voice came over the intercom with standard arrival information. His tone was professionally neutral, giving no indication of the confrontation that had occurred, but his closing words carried a subtle acknowledgement. "On behalf of Atlantic Airlines, I want to personally thank you for choosing to fly with us today. We strive to provide a respectful and equitable experience for all our passengers, and we appreciate your patience during today's flight." The emphasis on respectful and equitable was slight, but unmistakable to those who had witnessed the earlier events. It was a captain's way of acknowledging that standards had not been met, and that he was aware of it. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Devon finished securing his recording, ensuring it was properly saved and backed up to his cloud storage. The documentation that had transformed the power dynamic of the flight was now preserved beyond any possibility of deletion or alteration. When the seatbelt sign finally turned off, the usual rush to disembark began. Devon remained seated, allowing those in greater hurry to proceed first, a small courtesy that contrasted with the earlier characterizations of him as inconsiderate and aggressive. As passengers began to file out, Lisa Garza approached his row business card already extended. "My direct line is on the back," she said quietly. What I witnessed today was not just poor service. It was textbook discriminatory behavior that violated multiple company policies and possibly federal transportation laws. Her bracelet caught the light as she handed over the card, the words, "Speak truth to power," a fitting motto for what had transpired. Devon took the card with a nod of acknowledgement. "I appreciate your willingness to speak up. Not everyone does." "Professional obligation," she replied with a slight smile, "but also basic human decency." Tyler waited until Devon stood to exit, falling into step beside him in the aisle. "I have got about 30 minutes of video," he offered. "Starting from the overhead bin incident, through the captain's intervention. It is very clear what was happening. The nervous fidgeting that had characterized him earlier had completely vanished. He stood straight, his gaze direct and confident. That could be significant, Devon noted. Would you be willing to share that if needed for an official complaint or legal action? Absolutely, Tyler confirmed without hesitation. What happened was not right. I have seen it before with my mother. She is from El Salvador, works as a housekeeper. The way people sometimes treat her. He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. I should have spoken up sooner. You spoke up when it mattered, Devon assured him. As they neared the exit, Captain Wilson stood at the door thanking passengers as they deplaned. A courtesy that was standard for many flights, but carried additional significance today. When Devon approached, the captain extended his hand. Mr. Rhodes, a moment, if you do not mind. Devon paused, accepting the handshake with professional courtesy. I want to personally apologize for your experience today. Captain Wilson said, his voice low but clear. It falls well short of our airline's standards and my own expectations for my crew. I appreciate that, Captain, Devon replied. I will be filing a formal complaint with supporting evidence. The captain nodded, his expression serious. As you should. I have already logged my own incident report, which will be waiting for the chief purser when we complete this rotation. Ms. Parker's actions will be addressed. It was a significant statement from a captain, an acknowledgement of fault, and a commitment to accountability that went beyond generic corporate apologetics. As Devon continued toward the jet bridge, he passed Miranda Parker, who stood rigidly at her station, her expression frozen in professional neutrality that did not reach her eyes. Their gazes met briefly, hers flinching away, first the reality of recorded evidence having transformed her position from accuser to accused. The perfect French twist that had earlier symbolized her authority now seemed like armor, rigid and unyielding in the face of exposure. Judith Ellison was already hurrying ahead, her earlier confidence replaced by an evident desire to distance herself from the situation she had helped create. She pushed past slower passengers, ignoring the muttered objections her performance of vulnerability entirely abandoned, now that it no longer served her purpose. Her designer handbag, clutched so protectively throughout the flight, was now pulled close to her body like a shield. In the terminal, Devon paused to exchange contact information with both Lisa and Tyler, creating a small but significant network of witnesses who had observed and documented the same pattern of behavior. Their willingness to remain connected to potentially testify if needed transformed what might have been dismissed as subjective perception into corroborated evidence. What happens next? Tyler asked, his expression suggesting this was his first experience with such direct confrontation of discriminatory behavior. Devon's response was measured, reflecting both experience and strategic thinking. Documentation, formal complaints through appropriate channels, and if necessary, legal action. This is not about revenge. It is about accountability. Lisa nodded in professional agreement. Changes do not happen through silence. They happen through documented patterns and formal challenges to those patterns. As they parted ways in the terminal, each heading to their respective destinations, the immediate consequences of Flight 653 had already begun to unfold. Captain Wilson's incident report was being processed. Miranda Parker faced potential disciplinary action. Judith Ellison had experienced the rare consequence of having her behavior publicly challenged and documented. But for Devon Rhodes, this was just the beginning of a process he had navigated before. The methodical pursuit of accountability through official channels, backed by irrefutable evidence. The recording that had transformed the dynamic of the flight would now become the foundation for what came next, the pursuit of justice on the ground. 2 days after landing in San Francisco, Devon Rhodes sat in a sleek downtown law office. His recording device connected to a computer as Alexandra Martinez, 38, listened intently to selected portions of the flight audio. Her expression remained professional, but her eyes narrowed at particularly egregious moments. Judith's people, like you, comment. Miranda's keep an eye on him. Whisper the clear sound of water being spilled, followed by immediate blame reversal. The office spoke volumes about Alexandra's professional approach. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided panoramic views of San Francisco Bay, but the interior was designed for focus rather than distraction. Glass-enclosed meeting rooms lined one wall, each named after civil rights pioneers. Legal volumes and framed court decisions shared shelf space with artwork by local activists. On her desk, a small sculpture depicted balanced scales, not the traditional blindfolded figure, but open-eyed, suggesting justice that sees clearly rather than operating in darkness. Alexandra was a former civil rights attorney who now specialized in transportation discrimination cases. Her office walls displayed framed court decisions and news articles documenting successful cases against airlines, rail companies, and rideshare services. Her reputation for methodical preparation and unwavering persistence had made her both respected and feared in corporate legal circles. "This is exceptionally clear," she noted, pausing the playback. "Most cases rely on witness testimony and conflicting accounts. You have provided indisputable audio documentation of the entire progression." Her right hand unconsciously traced a pattern on her legal pad, a habit from her early days as a prosecutor, organizing thoughts before speaking. Devon nodded. "I have learned that memory can be questioned. Evidence rarely can." "Smart practice," Alexandra agreed. "And you have independent witnesses willing to corroborate." "3 confirmed," Devon replied, sliding a folder across the desk. "Tyler Ramirez, who recorded video of several key incidents. Lisa Garza, a corporate diversity trainer who recognized and documented the pattern of behavior. And Michael Rodriguez, the flight attendant who broke ranks with his colleague and noted the incidents in his official service log." Alexandra raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Flight crew testimony is particularly valuable. Courts tend to give it significant weight." She reviewed the contact information Devon had provided. "I will reach out to each of them today for preliminary statements." She turned to her computer, pulling up a document. "I have reviewed Atlantic Airlines non-discrimination policies. They are actually quite comprehensive, which works in our favor. The company explicitly prohibits exactly the behavior you experienced." She highlighted specific sections as she continued. "Their policy states, Atlantic Airlines is committed to providing equal and respectful service to all passengers, regardless of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, or disability status. Differential treatment based on these protected characteristics violates our core values and will not be tolerated." They have effectively created their own standard that Ms. Parker clearly violated. Devon leaned forward slightly. "My goal is not primarily financial compensation, though that should certainly be part of any resolution. What I want is structural change, tangible modifications to training, accountability measures, and public acknowledgement of the issue." Alexandra nodded, making notes. "That is actually strategically advantageous. Courts and companies both respond better to plaintiffs seeking constructive change rather than just monetary damages." She looked up. "What is your ideal outcome?" Devon had clearly considered this question in advance. A formal apology, acknowledging the specific discriminatory treatment. Comprehensive anti-bias training for all flight crews developed in consultation with experts in the field. Transparent reporting of discrimination complaints and their resolutions. And yes, appropriate financial compensation for the emotional distress and dignitary harm. All reasonable and achievable, Alexandra confirmed. "Here is how we will proceed. First, I will draft a formal complaint to Atlantic Airlines Customer Relations Department, including a transcript of key portions of your recording. We will give them 10 business days to respond, which is standard industry practice." She continued outlining the strategy. "Based on my experience with airlines, they will likely respond with a generic apology and a voucher offer, typically about 5 to 10% of the ticket price. This inadequate response gives us the foundation to escalate. Next, we will send a formal legal notice to their general counsel detailing the evidence and witnesses citing specific violations of their own policies, federal transportation regulations, and applicable civil rights statutes. This puts them on notice that we are prepared for litigation, but still open to appropriate resolution. Devon listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions that reflected his business background and strategic thinking. This was not emotional for him. It was methodical, a process of accountability he had navigated before in different contexts. Initiate protocol. D. Devon said, his voice taking on a more formal tone. Full documentation package, preparing for level 3 escalation. He unconsciously touched his father's Rolex as he spoke, a habit that emerged in moments of strategic decision-making, as if drawing strength from legacy. Alexandra looked at him with newfound understanding. This was not his first experience with such situations. He had developed a structured approach complete with terminology that suggested careful preparation and strategy. How do you want to handle media inquiries if this becomes public? Alexandra asked, addressing an important strategic consideration. I am not seeking publicity, Devon replied. But I will not hide from it either if the airline's response makes it necessary. The truth should be told, especially if it can prevent others from experiencing similar treatment. Alexandra made another note. I agree. Strategic media engagement can sometimes accelerate resolution when companies realize the potential reputational damage. She closed her notebook. One last question. Do you have the original unedited recording? Devon nodded. The complete file is backed up in 3 separate secure locations with timestamps and metadata intact. I can provide access as needed. Perfect, Alexandra said with professional satisfaction. Chain of custody and data integrity are crucial for admissibility if this does proceed to formal litigation. She stood, extending her hand. Mr. Rhodes, based on the evidence you have provided and my experience with similar cases, you have an exceptionally strong position. Atlantic Airlines will likely realize this once we present the full documentation. Devon shook her hand, his grip firm and confident. Then let us proceed. This is not just about one flight or one passenger. It is about changing patterns that affect countless travelers every day. As he left Alexandra's office, Devon felt the familiar mix of determination and measured optimism that had characterized his approach to similar challenges throughout his career. The recording that had shifted the power dynamic at 35,000 feet would now begin its work on the ground, transforming individual accountability into institutional change. The legal machinery had been set in motion, methodical and purpose-driven, and somewhere in the Atlantic Airlines corporate structure, the ripples of Flight 653 were about to reach shores that no one had anticipated. 3 weeks after submitting the formal complaint to Atlantic Airlines, Devon Rhodes received exactly what Alexandra Martinez had predicted: a formulaic apology letter expressing regret for any discomfort experienced and offering a $150 flight voucher. The response made no mention of the specific discriminatory incidents, provided no information about any internal investigation, and offered no commitment to addressing the underlying issues. Alexandra forwarded the response to Devon with a single comment: as expected. Phase 2 begins. That same day, she sent a comprehensive legal notice to Atlantic Airlines General Counsel. The 15-page document detailed specific violations of company policy, federal transportation regulations, and civil rights statutes. It included transcribed excerpts from Devon's recording statements from all 3 witnesses and Captain Wilson's incident report, which they had obtained through appropriate channels. The letter concluded with non-negotiable demands: a formal public apology acknowledging the discriminatory treatment, mandatory comprehensive anti-bias training for all flight crew, termination of Miranda Parker for multiple policy violations, and substantial financial compensation for emotional distress and dignitary harm. For 1 week, there was silence from Atlantic Airlines. Then Alexandra received a curt email from their legal department requesting a meeting to discuss resolution options. It was the corporate equivalent of recognizing they were in a vulnerable position. The meeting took place at Atlantic's corporate headquarters, a gleaming glass tower in downtown San Francisco, with the company's stylized wing logo dominating the lobby. The conference room was deliberately imposing 21st floor views, an oversized mahogany table, and corporate history lining the walls in framed achievements and awards. It was an environment designed to intimidate, to establish power through surroundings. Jonathan Porter, the airline's chief legal counsel, greeted them with professional courtesy that did not reach his eyes. His tailored suit and carefully modulated voice projected corporate confidence, but the slight tension in his shoulders revealed awareness of his precarious position. These claims are greatly exaggerated and mischaracterize what was essentially a service misunderstanding. Porter began, his tone dismissive. While we regret Mr. Rhodes's experience, we see no evidence of intentional discrimination. Devon remained silent, letting Alexandra respond. She simply opened her laptop and played a 3-minute compilation of the recording. Judith's "people like you" comment, Miranda's clear differential treatment, and the water spill followed by blame reversal. Porter's expression tightened as he listened. When the audio ended, he cleared his throat. This is concerning but still subject to interpretation. His fingers tapped a nervous rhythm on the mahogany table, betraying uncertainty his words attempted to conceal. Interpretation. Alexandra raised an eyebrow. Your own captain filed an incident report supporting our version of events. Would you like to hear the witness statements next? She kept her tone professional, but the glint in her eye suggested a prosecutor who knew she held the stronger hand. Porter shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps we can discuss a more substantial settlement offer. This is not about money, Devon interjected calmly. It is about accountability and change. The meeting ended with Porter promising to review the evidence more thoroughly and respond within a week. His dismissive attitude made it clear that despite the evidence, Atlantic was still hoping to minimize the incident rather than address it substantively. Before that week had elapsed, Alexandra connected Devon with Vanessa Thompson, 35, an investigative journalist known for her in-depth coverage of corporate accountability issues. Alexandra had worked with Vanessa on previous transportation discrimination cases and respected her thorough, fact-based approach. I do not typically advise media engagement this early in negotiations, Alexandra explained during their conference call. But Atlantic's dismissive initial response suggests they are hoping to minimize this, rather than address it substantively. Strategic media pressure can accelerate their recognition of the seriousness of the situation. Devon agreed, and the meeting with Vanessa was arranged at a quiet cafe in San Francisco. Vanessa arrived with a reporter's notebook and digital recorder, her approach professional but conversational. Her style was distinctive. Silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, rectangular glasses that she adjusted when concentrating, and a habit of repeating key points back to ensure accuracy. I am interested in this story because it represents a pattern I have been tracking, she explained. Transportation discrimination often goes unreported or unaddressed because most passengers do not have the documentation you collected. Devon shared the key details of his experience, providing Vanessa with carefully selected audio excerpts that had been reviewed by Alexandra for legal implications. He also connected her with Tyler and Lisa, who both agreed to be interviewed about what they had witnessed. Vanessa's resulting article, published in a major national news outlet, was titled, "Recorded How One Passenger Documented Racial Bias at 35,000 Feet." The piece was meticulously reported with direct quotes from the audio recording witness statements and expert commentary from civil rights attorneys and aviation policy specialists. The article avoided sensationalism in favor of factual precision, which made its impact all the more significant. It included a statement from Atlantic Airlines acknowledging they were investigating the incident, but offering no substantive response to the specific allegations. Within hours of publication, the story was picked up by major news networks, social media accounts with large followings, and industry publications. Hashtags like #Flight653 and #RecordedBias began trending. The court of public opinion had convened, and the evidence was damning. What transformed the story from a one-day headline into sustained coverage was the audio recording itself. Brief excerpts released with the article provided undeniable evidence that contradicted the typical corporate defense of misunderstanding or differing perceptions. Judith's "people like you." Comment Miranda's differential tone when addressing different passengers, and the captain's eventual intervention created a compelling narrative arc that resonated with readers and viewers. The public reaction was swift and powerful. Atlantic Airlines' social media accounts were flooded with comments from customers expressing disappointment and reconsidering their loyalty. Industry analysts began discussing the potential financial impact of the reputational damage. Current and former flight attendants came forward with stories of witnessing similar incidents, suggesting a broader pattern rather than an isolated occurrence. For Miranda Parker, the media exposure was devastating. Though her full name was not used in the initial article, she was identified as Flight Attendant MP. Her voice was recognizable to colleagues and friends. Her previously private social media accounts were discovered by internet sleuths, revealing posts that, while not overtly racist, suggested patterns of bias that aligned with her behavior on Flight 653. Atlantic Airlines found itself in a corporate crisis spiral. Their stock price dipped by 3% in 2 days, a significant move for a major airline. Corporate clients began quietly inquiring about the company's diversity policies and training programs. Competitors seized the opportunity to highlight their own anti-discrimination initiatives. The pressure intensified when Vanessa published a follow-up piece featuring interviews with Michael Rodriguez and 3 other Atlantic Airlines flight attendants speaking anonymously, who described an internal culture that often overlooked or minimized bias complaints. This broader context transformed Devon's individual experience into evidence of a structural pattern, exactly the framing that created maximum corporate vulnerability. Devon himself maintained a dignified public profile throughout the media exposure. In his one television interview, he emphasized that his goal was accountability and structural change, not punitive action for its own sake. "This is not about one flight attendant or one airline," he explained calmly to the interviewer. "It is about acknowledging that these patterns exist and taking concrete steps to address them." Documentation transforms denied experiences into irrefutable evidence. His measured approach enhanced the credibility of his position and made it difficult for Atlantic Airlines to dismiss him as seeking publicity or excessive compensation. Instead, he emerged as a principled professional, using appropriate means to address a legitimate grievance. 7 days after the initial article was published, with public pressure mounting and the story showing no signs of fading from the news cycle, Atlantic Airlines General Counsel contacted Alexandra Martinez with a new urgency. "We need to meet immediately," the email stated. "The board is directly involved now and has authorized me to seek a comprehensive resolution." Alexandra forwarded the message to Devon with a simple note. The recording that shifted power in the cabin has now shifted power in the boardroom. Phase 3 begins. The media exposure had accomplished what months of legal negotiation might not have. It had elevated the issue from a customer service matter to a corporate governance crisis. And as Devon prepared for the meeting that would determine the ultimate resolution, he knew that the evidence he had methodically collected would be the foundation for whatever came next. The meeting took place in a conference room at Atlantic Airlines' San Francisco corporate offices. Devon Rhodes and Alexandra Martinez arrived precisely on time, carrying slim briefcases that contrasted with the stacks of folders and multiple laptops arrayed on the other side of the table. The atmosphere was noticeably different from their first meeting. The imposing conference room that had earlier been meant to intimidate now felt like a stage set for corporate contrition. The blinds had been partially opened, softening the harsh fluorescent lighting. Water pitchers and glasses had been arranged with careful symmetry. Even the seating had been reconfigured, no longer positioning Devon and Alexandra at the far end, but bringing them closer to the center of the table. These subtle adjustments revealed a company preparing to negotiate rather than dismiss. Jonathan Porter, 50, Atlantic's chief legal counsel stood to greet them with practiced corporate courtesy that could not mask the tension in his posture. Beside him sat 3 members of his legal team, and Eleanor Williams, 60, the airline's vice president of customer experience, whose presence signaled the escalation of the case beyond routine legal matters. Williams' presence was particularly significant, her silver-framed glasses and immaculate suit projecting corporate authority, while the subtle lines of concern around her eyes suggested genuine discomfort with the situation. "Thank you for meeting with us." Porter began once everyone was seated. "We appreciate the opportunity to discuss this situation directly and find a path forward that addresses your concerns." His tone had shifted from the dismissive confidence of their first meeting to a more measured acknowledgement that serious negotiation was necessary. Alexandra smiled politely, but did not soften her professional demeanor. "Let us be clear from the outset, Mr. Porter. We are not here to negotiate whether discrimination occurred. The evidence established that definitively. We are here to discuss appropriate remedies for that discrimination." Porter shifted slightly in his seat. "Atlantic Airlines takes all passenger concerns seriously, and we are committed to providing an equitable experience for everyone who flies with us. What Mr. Rhodes experienced was unfortunate and fell short of our service standards." What Mr. Rhodes experienced, Alexandra interrupted firmly, was not merely poor service. It was a pattern of discriminatory treatment based on race documented with irrefutable audio evidence corroborated by multiple witnesses, including your own flight crew, and acknowledged by the captain of the flight. Let us not minimize what occurred. She opened her laptop and turned it to face the Atlantic team. "Before we proceed further, I would like to play one composite sequence from Mr. Rhodes's recording. 3 minutes that capture the essence of what occurred." Without waiting for permission, she pressed play. The audio was crystal clear. "Judith's people like you comment Miranda's immediate siding with her against Devon, the stark contrast in service tone between passengers, and finally, the deliberate water spill followed by blame reversal." The conference room was silent when the playback ended. Eleanor Williams looked visibly disturbed, while Porter maintained his professional mask, though his discomfort was evident in his tightened jaw. "That recording has now been heard by our entire legal team, the board of directors, and selected portions by approximately 2 million people via news coverage and social media," Alexandra noted calmly. "Additional witnesses are prepared to testify to what they observed, including Captain Wilson and Flight Attendant Rodriguez." She closed her laptop with deliberate precision. "So let us dispense with the euphemisms and address reality. We have 4 non-negotiable demands for resolution of this matter." Devon spoke for the first time, his tone measured and professional. "First, a public apology from Atlantic Airlines, acknowledging the specific discriminatory treatment I experienced, not a generic statement about service standards." Alexandra continued. "Second, implementation of mandatory comprehensive anti-bias training for all flight crews developed in consultation with qualified experts in the field, with transparent reporting on completion rates and effectiveness measures. Third, Devon added termination of Flight Attendant Miranda Parker for multiple violations of company non-discrimination policies, federal transportation regulations, and basic professional conduct standards. And fourth, Alexandra concluded financial compensation of $3.5 million for the emotional distress, dignitary harm, and public humiliation Mr. Rhodes experienced as a direct result of discrimination while in Atlantic's care." Porter's eyes widened slightly at the compensation figure, but he maintained his composure. "Those are significant demands. I will need to—" "They are proportionate demands," Alexandra corrected. "And before you suggest they are excessive, let me outline the alternative." She leaned forward slightly. "We file a federal lawsuit alleging violations of civil rights statutes in commercial transportation. That filing becomes public record, generating another wave of media coverage. We request the right to present the complete audio recording in open court, ensuring it becomes part of the permanent public record." She continued with precision that reflected years of similar negotiations. Discovery will require Atlantic to produce all discrimination complaints from the past 5 years, all personnel records for Ms. Parker, all training materials related to bias prevention, and all internal communications regarding this incident. The litigation will likely take 18 to 24 months, during which Atlantic will face ongoing reputational damage and uncertainty, Devon added quietly, and during which the recording will remain in the public consciousness, a continuous reminder of what your airline permitted to occur. Eleanor Williams spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the authority of her executive position. What assurance do we have that if we meet these demands, this matter will be fully resolved without further public airing? A standard confidentiality agreement covering the financial settlement, only, Alexandra replied. The training implementation and policy changes would remain public as they should be. Mr. Rhodes is not interested in ongoing publicity, but he is committed to meaningful change. Porter exchanged glances with Williams' unspoken corporate calculations, evident in their expressions. He then surprised them both by pushing back firmly. Your demands are overreaching and punitive. Porter stated, we acknowledge there was a service failure, but $3.5 million is completely disproportionate. We would consider $500,000 with the same confidentiality provisions and a general commitment to review our training programs. That is not a serious counteroffer, Alexandra replied coolly. Your own corporate policies acknowledge that discrimination is not a service failure. It is a violation of civil rights, and a general commitment to review suggests you are still not recognizing the gravity of what occurred. Porter's expression hardened. These are complex situations with multiple perspectives. That is not a mistake. Devon interjected, his voice level but penetrating. That is your character speaking without your consent. The directness of his statement created a momentary silence in the room. Porter blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the precision of Devon's rebuke. Williams cleared her throat. Mr. Porter, may I speak with you privately for a moment? They stepped out, leaving Devon and Alexandra with the junior legal team, who avoided eye contact, busying themselves with papers and laptops. Through the glass walls of the conference room, Devon could see Williams speaking animatedly to Porter in the hallway, her gestures suggesting a difference of opinion on strategy. When Porter and Williams returned 10 minutes later, there was a subtle shift in their demeanor. Williams had moved slightly ahead of Porter, taking the lead position, a change in dynamics that suggested an executive decision had overruled legal caution. We have conferred. Porter began, his tone markedly different. Atlantic Airlines is prepared to meet your demands with some modifications. We will issue a public apology acknowledging the discriminatory treatment Mr. Rhodes experienced. We will implement comprehensive anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff. Ms. Parker's employment has already been terminated effective yesterday. He paused before addressing the final point. Regarding financial compensation, we propose $2.8 million, with standard confidentiality provisions applying only to the settlement amount. Alexandra glanced at Devon, who gave a slight nod. We can accept those terms, she replied, provided the apology is submitted to us for review before publication, and the training program includes input from qualified experts we approve. The negotiation of specific details continued for another hour, but the fundamental agreement had been reached. By late afternoon, preliminary documents were signed with final agreements to be executed within 3 business days. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor Williams approached Devon directly. Mr. Rhodes, as an executive of this airline, I want to personally apologize for what you experienced. It was unacceptable and contrary to everything we claim to stand for. Her eyes, which had maintained a professional distance throughout the meeting, now revealed genuine regret. Devon accepted her apology with professional courtesy. The true measure will be in the changes implemented and their effectiveness in preventing similar incidents for future passengers. The legal proceedings had reached their formal conclusion, but the impact of Flight 653 was only beginning to ripple through Atlantic Airlines and the broader industry. A recording that began as personal protection had transformed into a catalyst for corporate change, its quiet testimony more powerful than the loudest protestations. As Devon and Alexandra left the building, he reflected on the journey from that initial confrontation over his extended leg to this corporate boardroom resolution. The power of documentation had once again transformed a potential injustice into undeniable accountability. The formal resolution of Devon Rhodes' complaint against Atlantic Airlines unfolded over the following weeks with remarkable speed, driven by the undeniable evidence and the company's desire to limit further reputational damage. True to their agreement, Atlantic Airlines issued a public apology that specifically acknowledged the discriminatory treatment based on race experienced by Mr. Devon Rhodes on Flight 653. The statement continued. This incident reflected a failure at multiple levels, from individual actions to insufficient training and oversight. We accept full responsibility and are implementing concrete changes to ensure such treatment never occurs again on our aircraft. The apology made headlines in industry publications and was featured prominently on Atlantic's website and social media channels. The public response was mixed. Some praised the accountability, while others criticized the company for requiring such overwhelming evidence before acknowledging discrimination that passengers had reported for years. The financial settlement of $2.8 million was processed without delay, though as agreed, the specific amount remained confidential. What became public knowledge, however, was Devon's announcement that he would use a substantial portion of the settlement to establish the Dignity in Transit Foundation, dedicated to combating discrimination in transportation through education advocacy and legal support for affected travelers. For Miranda Parker, the consequences were severe and immediate. Her termination from Atlantic Airlines became effectively a permanent exit from the commercial aviation industry. Other airlines, aware of the circumstances, even without her name being publicly disclosed, were unwilling to accept the liability of hiring her. Her 23 years of experience became irrelevant overnight, her professional identity erased by 15 minutes of documented bias. She attempted to reframe her story in conversations with former colleagues, positioning herself as the victim of corporate scapegoating and cancel culture. But the recording left little room for such revisionism. The cold reality was that her own words and actions, preserved without distortion, had eliminated any possibility of plausible deniability. At night alone in her apartment, Miranda oscillated between anger at the unfairness of her situation and creeping doubt about her own actions. The recording had forced her to hear herself as others heard her. The tone shifts, the immediate assumptions, the clear differential treatment. In her more honest moments, these realizations brought waves of shame that she quickly suppressed, returning to the safer territory of self-justification and blame. Judith Ellison faced no formal consequences. She was not an airline employee and had broken no laws that could be prosecuted. But the social consequences proved significant. Though her full name was never published in news accounts within her social circles, the connection was eventually made. Friends who had seen the news coverage recognized details of the story from Judith's own earlier accounts, which she had shared from her perspective before the recording became public. Invitations to social events grew scarcer. Charitable boards on which she had served began to find reasons why her presence was no longer required. The country club where she had been a fixture for decades became an uncomfortable space as whispers followed her through the dining room. The social capital she had accumulated over a lifetime eroded steadily, leaving her increasingly isolated. For Tyler Ramirez, the experience proved transformative. His decision to record and speak up against injustice became a defining moment that shaped his subsequent career path. After successfully completing his tech interview in San Francisco, he incorporated ethical considerations into his professional focus, eventually specializing in algorithmic fairness and bias detection in artificial intelligence systems. He and Devon maintained occasional contact, their connection forged in that unique crucible of Flight 653. Tyler's willingness to be a witness despite his initial nervousness remained a source of quiet pride, a moment when he had chosen the harder right over the easier wrong. Lisa Garza found her professional expertise in corporate anti-discrimination training suddenly in higher demand. Atlantic Airlines hired her firm to help develop their mandated training program, and several other airlines proactively engaged her services to review their own policies and procedures. The incident became a case study in her training materials, though she always presented it with appropriate anonymity and focus on structural lessons rather than individual shaming. Michael Rodriguez received both praise and criticism within Atlantic Airlines for his decision to break ranks with a senior colleague. Some flight attendants viewed him as disloyal to the profession. Others recognized his courage in upholding both company policy and basic human dignity. The airline, recognizing his integrity, eventually promoted him to a training role where he could directly influence the culture of new flight attendants joining the company. Captain James Wilson continued his career without significant disruption, his handling of the situation viewed by airline management as appropriate and professional. His willingness to directly address the discrimination rather than minimize or ignore it established him as a model for other captains facing similar situations. The most substantial and far-reaching consequences emerged at the institutional level. Atlantic Airlines implemented the promised comprehensive anti-bias training with Devon's Foundation, providing input on its development. The company established new reporting mechanisms for passengers experiencing discrimination with transparent tracking of complaints and resolutions. These changes, initially forced by the settlement agreement, gradually became points of corporate pride, as Atlantic positioned itself as an industry leader in equitable treatment. 6 months after the settlement, the first concrete results of these institutional changes became visible. Atlantic Airlines launched its Respect in Flight initiative, which included 1. A mandatory 4-hour interactive training module for all flight crews that incorporated real-world scenarios and required demonstration of appropriate responses to potential discrimination. 2. The introduction of accountability partners on each flight, designated crew members responsible for monitoring and addressing potential discrimination issues. 3. A passenger reporting system that allowed for real-time feedback via the in-flight entertainment system, with guaranteed review by management within 24 hours. 4. Quarterly public reporting of discrimination complaints, including specific actions taken in response. 5. The creation of a passenger advocacy board with diverse membership to review policies and provide ongoing recommendations. These specific concrete changes went well beyond generic corporate commitments, creating measurable benchmarks and public accountability. Other airlines, recognizing the potential reputational and financial costs of similar incidents, proactively reviewed their own training and accountability systems. Industry publications featured articles on bias prevention and response protocols. The recording that had shifted power in a single aircraft cabin had triggered ripples of change throughout commercial aviation. For Devon Rhodes, the resolution brought a measure of validation, but no particular satisfaction. This was not his first experience with discrimination, nor would it be his last. But the establishment of the Dignity in Transit Foundation gave purpose to the experience, transforming an individual incident into a mechanism for broader change. At the Foundation's inaugural event, Devon addressed the assembled supporters with characteristic thoughtfulness. Documentation transforms denied experiences into irrefutable evidence, he noted. But evidence alone does not create change. Change requires acknowledgement, accountability, and structural modifications to prevent recurrence. Today, we begin the work of ensuring that dignity in transit is not a privilege for some, but a right for all. The resolution of Flight 653 had concluded, but its consequences continued to unfold across multiple lives and institutions. The recording that began as personal protection had become a catalyst for change, its quiet testimony more powerful than the loudest protestations of innocence or denial. 3 weeks after the chance encounter at the Arizona diner, Devon Rhodes received an envelope at his foundation office. The return address was unfamiliar, the handwriting precise but slightly unsteady. Inside was a single page typed, but signed by hand. Mr. Rhodes, you will not remember me by name. I was the flight attendant on Atlantic Airlines Flight 653 5 years ago, who treated you with discriminatory disrespect and enabled the prejudiced behavior of another passenger. I am not writing to ask for your forgiveness. I understand that is neither required nor deserved. I am writing because our brief encounter at the diner where I now work forced me to finally confront the truth I have been avoiding for 5 years. The truth is simple. I was wrong. My treatment of you was not just unprofessional, but deeply unjust. I allowed assumptions and biases I did not even recognize to dictate my actions. I sided automatically with a passenger who looked like me against one who did not. When challenged, I escalated rather than reflected. When exposed, I blamed rather than accepted. For years, I told myself I was the victim of an overly sensitive society of corporate abandonment of bad luck. Seeing you again, your dignity intact, your success undiminished, your absence of bitterness, shattered that self-serving narrative completely. You were right when you said reconciliation with my own actions matters more than any words exchanged with you. This letter is part of that reconciliation process. I am acknowledging without qualification or excuse that my behavior was discriminatory, unprofessional, and wrong. I have begun working with a local community center, participating in their diversity awareness programs. It is a small step, but perhaps by acknowledging my own failings, I can help others recognize and address theirs before they cause similar harm. The recording you made did not ruin my life as I claimed for so long. It simply ensured that I could not escape the consequences of my own actions. For that painful but necessary accountability, I am finally belatedly grateful. Miranda Parker. Devon read the letter twice, noting its absence of excuses or qualifications. There was no request for help, no subtle plea for intervention to restore her former life. It was, as she had stated, simply part of her own reconciliation process. He placed the letter in a folder where he kept significant documents related to the Foundation's work, not as a trophy or vindication, but as evidence that accountability, however painful, could sometimes lead to genuine reflection and change. He did not write back. There was nothing that needed to be said. The letter itself was both the message and the response, a closing chapter to a story that had transformed multiple lives and institutions. Miranda Parker's journey toward redemption was her own, to navigate neither accelerated nor impeded by his involvement. The letter suggested she had finally taken the first crucial step, acknowledging the reality of her actions without defensiveness or deflection. What Devon could not see was the weeks of internal struggle that had preceded Miranda's letter. She had drafted and discarded a dozen versions, some defensive, some pleading, some angry. The final version came only after a night of brutal self-honesty, when she finally confronted the recording in her memory and heard herself as others had heard her. The shame had been overwhelming, but also finally clarifying. Her journey was far from complete. There would be days when the old resentments resurfaced, when she backslid into self-justification. But she had taken the hardest step, acknowledging that the enemy was not Devon Rhodes or Atlantic Airlines or cancel culture, but her own unexamined bias made manifest in word and deed. Whether this acknowledgement would lead to meaningful change in her life remained to be seen. But the simple fact of its existence represented something profound, the power of documented truth to eventually penetrate even the strongest defenses of denial and self-justification. The recording that had transformed a flight, an airline, and an industry had finally achieved its most difficult task, compelling the confrontation of an individual with her own unvarnished reality. 5 years after Flight 653, the impact of that single documented incident had rippled far beyond the individual lives directly involved. What might have remained an isolated experience of discrimination forgotten by all except the person who endured it had instead catalyzed measurable change across multiple domains. The Dignity in Transit Foundation, established with a portion of Devon's settlement, had grown into a respected advocacy organization with 3 primary functions. Its education division, worked with transportation companies to develop effective anti-bias training. Its support network provided resources and guidance for travelers experiencing discrimination, and its legal arm selectively represented individuals in cases where evidence suggested structural patterns of bias. In its 5 years of operation, the foundation had consulted on training programs for 17 airlines, 4 national rail services, and numerous regional transportation authorities. Its mobile app, which provided real-time guidance for documenting discriminatory treatment, had been downloaded over 2 million times and had been used to successfully challenge discriminatory practices in over 200 individual cases. The Foundation's Record for Rights initiative had equipped vulnerable travelers with discrete recording tools and legal resources, creating a network of documentation that made denial of discrimination increasingly difficult. Each successful case built upon the precedent established by Flight 653, creating a growing body of evidence that transformed individual incidents into recognized patterns requiring institutional response. One particular success story stood out. Maria Gonzalez, a 67-year-old grandmother traveling to visit her family, had used the Foundation's app to document repeated refusals of service on a cross-country train journey. The resulting lawsuit not only provided compensation to Ms. Gonzalez, but led to a complete overhaul of service protocols for the entire rail line, affecting thousands of passengers daily. Atlantic Airlines, initially forced into change by the settlement agreement, had ultimately embraced its role as an industry leader in equitable treatment. The comprehensive anti-bias training developed in consultation with experts, including Lisa Garza's firm, had been implemented across all levels of the company, from frontline staff to executive leadership. The airline had established transparent reporting of discrimination complaints, publishing quarterly statistics and resolution outcomes. These accountability measures, once viewed as potential liability risks by corporate lawyers, became marketing advantages as consumer preferences increasingly factored ethical considerations into purchasing decisions. Atlantic's passenger satisfaction ratings among travelers of color had increased by 47% since implementing the changes sparked by Flight 653. Perhaps most significantly, Atlantic had implemented a revolutionary policy called Equal Cabin Protocol, which established standardized service scripts and procedures that eliminated many opportunities for differential treatment. Flight attendants were now trained to use the same greetings tone and service language with all passengers, creating a baseline of consistency that made deviations immediately noticeable. Tyler Ramirez had flourished in his tech career, specializing in algorithmic fairness and bias detection in artificial intelligence systems. His experience on Flight 653 had sensitized him to the ways bias could be encoded in seemingly neutral systems, shaping his professional focus in unexpected ways. He occasionally spoke at tech ethics conferences, sharing his story of transitioning from passive witness to active documenter. Sometimes courage is not dramatic, he would tell audiences. Sometimes it is just pressing record when you see something wrong. Lisa Garza's corporate training practice had expanded significantly, with airlines and other transportation companies forming a substantial client base. She had developed specialized modules using anonymized elements from Flight 653 as case studies, helping employees recognize and address patterns of differential treatment before they escalated to documented incidents. Michael Rodriguez had advanced to a senior training position within Atlantic Airlines. His willingness to uphold principles over hierarchy, ultimately recognized as an organizational asset rather than a liability. He took particular pride in mentoring new flight attendants, emphasizing both technical proficiency and ethical responsibility in equal measure. Captain James Wilson had retired from active flying, but remained involved with Atlantic as a training consultant, helping develop protocols for flight deck intervention in cases of observed discrimination. His handling of the incident on Flight 653 became a model case study in captain's authority and responsibility. Judith Ellison had gradually faded from her former social circles. The accumulated weight of subtle exclusions, eventually compelling her to relocate to another city. Whether she had reflected on her role in the incident remained unknown. Unlike Miranda, she had never reached out to acknowledge her actions or their impact. The broader industry had responded to the public documentation of discrimination with substantial policy revisions. Major airlines implemented enhanced training, more accessible complaint procedures, and clearer accountability measures. Industry publications featured articles on bias prevention and response protocols. The recording that had shifted power in a single aircraft cabin had triggered ripples of change throughout commercial aviation. For Devon Rhodes, the legacy of Flight 653 was both personal and institutional. On a personal level, the incident had reinforced his practice of documentation as protection, not out of paranoia, but pragmatic recognition of reality. On an institutional level, it had provided a platform for advancing changes he had long recognized as necessary across transportation systems. He did not define himself by that single flight or its aftermath. His primary identity remained his work as a venture capitalist, with the foundation representing an important but secondary aspect of his professional life. Yet he recognized that the recording made that day had achieved something significant. It had transformed what might have been dismissed as subjective perception into undeniable fact, creating accountability where there might otherwise have been only denial. At a foundation event marking its 5th anniversary, Devon addressed the assembled supporters and transportation industry representatives with characteristic thoughtfulness. The power of documentation is not in punishing individuals, he noted. It is in creating irrefutable evidence that compels institutional change. A single recorded incident can reveal patterns that have been denied for decades. And once revealed, these patterns become impossible to ignore. He continued, gesturing to the diverse audience before him. 5 years ago, one flight attendant's actions were recorded. Today, 17 airlines have transformed their training. That is the legacy of documentation. Not retribution, but reformation. The recording that had begun as personal protection had ultimately served a much larger purpose. It had provided proof that could not be dismissed, denied, or reinterpreted. And in doing so, it had created the necessary foundation for meaningful change, both in individual lives and in the structures that shaped them. The legacy of Flight 653 continued to unfold, one documented truth at a time. As Devon Rhodes stood at the window of his San Francisco office, watching planes trace their paths across the evening sky, he reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple decision to record his interactions on Flight 653. The recording had not been born of a desire for confrontation or exposure. It had been a quiet act of self-protection, a recognition that in a world where his experiences might be dismissed or denied, documentation provided the most powerful defense. What had transformed it from personal protection to catalyst for change was not the act of recording itself, but the truth it had preserved, unfiltered, undeniable, and ultimately unavoidable. In the 5 years since that flight, he had witnessed the dual power of documented truth, its ability to compel accountability and its capacity to inspire change. The recording had forced a reckoning, not just for Miranda Parker or Atlantic Airlines, but for an industry that had too often dismissed reports of discrimination as subjective perception or isolated incidents. The most profound impact, however, lay not in what had been changed, but in what had been revealed. The recording had shown that dignity was not a privilege to be granted or withheld based on appearance or assumption, but a fundamental right that belonged to every traveler. And in revealing this truth, it had created the possibility for a different future, one in which transportation spaces became more equitable, not through hope or intention, but through accountability and evidence. As dusk deepened, and the office lights of neighboring buildings began to illuminate the cityscape, Devon turned from the window, returning to the investment portfolio he had been reviewing. Flight 653 was part of his story, but it did not define him. The foundation that had emerged from it represented important work, but his primary focus remained his venture capital career, identifying and supporting innovations that could shape the future. Yet he carried with him always the lesson of that flight, that power often resided not in confrontation, but in documentation, not in accusations, but in evidence. It was a lesson that had served him well throughout his career, reinforcing his meticulous attention to detail and his preference for documented facts over emotional appeals. The recording device that had once captured Miranda Parker's biased treatment was now a standard part of his daily equipment, as routine as his phone or wallet. Not because he expected discrimination at every turn, but because he recognized that in a world still struggling with bias, documentation transformed denied experiences into irrefutable evidence. And evidence, as Flight 653 had proven, created the foundation for change, not through vengeance or retribution, but through the quiet, inexorable power of truth that could no longer be denied. This story reminds us all that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination isn't anger or confrontation, but careful documentation and strategic action. If you found this account of Flight 653 powerful, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice and accountability, and share this with someone who might benefit from Devon's approach. Your support helps us continue sharing these important narratives that can transform individual experiences into catalysts for lasting change. Remember, in a world where bias still exists, your phone may be your most powerful tool for justice.